Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is the Ukraine War News Update for the 27th of October 2023. Let's get straight to where we normally start. The Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats apply, and you can find them in the description to this video below. 560 personnel lost is not as high as we have seen for the last week. There's been a really significant uptick, one assumes, as a result of the Avdiivka Russian offensive. 560 is still on the upper end of the figures we were seeing previous to that attack. So really we had seen from sort of 350 to 550 for quite a large proportion of this counteroffensive period. But still, 560 is still a significant number. It's just not what we've seen for the last week. 4 tanks and 11 APVs, 7 artillery systems. Those are severe drops from previous figures. Still, 11 APVs is not a great number of vehicles to be losing a day for the Russians. Still significant, but certainly down from where we have seen those figures. No MLRS or anti-aircraft warfare systems over the last 24 hours, according to these figures. 1 drone and 1 cruise missile, that'd be from the night before. 6 vehicles and fuel tanks, and 1 piece of special equipment. So much lower numbers, possibly reflective of the decrease in intensity of attacks across the front line. Not to say there still isn't an awful lot of activity, of course. Andrew Perpetua, the pro-Ukrainian mapper, morally speaking, but really objective, who looks at the video feeds and information across the socials with regard to what has been destroyed over or damaged over the last week, over the last 24 hours, brings out his daily list here, and the list yet again is giving a 4-to-1, 5-to-1 loss ratio, Russian to Ukrainian losses. If you look at the Ukrainian losses, there is an air defense system, Estrela 10, short-range air defense system. If you're going to lose an air defense system, that's probably, well, really you want to probably lose an auto cannon on the back of a vehicle, but that's not your highest value air defense system, but still a bit of a loss there for the Ukrainians. And Armada thrown in there as well. That's the German-provided infantry fighting vehicle. There's a Kirpi, or the Hedgehog, which is the Turkish-provided mine-resistant ambush protection vehicle. But yeah, bit of a range of stuff lost there. As far as the Russians are concerned, they've lost a R330 Zhetel electronic warfare system. That's a fairly decent bit of kit that they have lost there. Quite a bit of artillery, few tanks, T80, T72B3, T90M. So that's a breakthrough tank. That's their most capable tank by all accounts. That's been at least damaged. T72 as well. So yeah, and APCs and infantry fighting vehicles make up most of the rest of the stuff, with some logistical vehicles, a few Bukanka, loaf vans, Scooby-Doo vans, and Urals and whatnot. So quite a variety there for the Russians, a few bits of surveillance and comms equipment too. That just suggests the Russians are losing out in terms of equipment by really significant margins still. Okay, let's see if we can understand these figures a little bit better. I'm going to dip into a Guardian article here. What's this all for? Russian deserters call on former comrades to join them. So this is going into look at some of the anecdotal accounts of Russians who have deserted and what's happened to them, and that actually they're calling on other people to join them, people escaping across the borders as well here. So here we have both men were helped in their flight, so it gives you an account of some men who have escaped. Were helped in their flight by the Georgia-based anti-war organization Idait Lezom, an idiom that literally means go through the forest in Russian. The phrase is most often deployed as a curse, roughly translatable to go F yourself, which was what one of the soldiers said to the Russian authorities by deserting. Idait Lezom's founder, Grigory Sverdlin, said his group had helped more than 500 soldiers to desert so far. If we find out, he says, if we find out a person is involved in war crimes, we will not help him, Verdlin said. But we are not investigative agencies. We reason pragmatically. Even if he managed to shoot 3 times, let him not shoot the 4th. And then there will be someone to investigate war crimes. We believe that this is absolutely correct, both from a humanistic point of view and from a pragmatic one, so that Putin has fewer soldiers. The group has recently seen a noticeable increase in requests from those wanting to desert, in an assessment backed up by data released by the Russian court system, where, according to a tally by the independent news outlet Mediazona, 2,076 criminal cases were opened in the first half of 2023 against soldiers accused of abandoning their units without official leave. This is twice that of the total of 2022 and 3 times higher than the pre-war figure for 2021. The real numbers are likely to be greater given the Kremlin's systematic attempts to hide information about the military. It is an interesting account. There's lots more to say about this, but an uptick in those deserting. Here we have a Georgian organization helping those to desert, and deserters calling on their comrades to join them in their desertion. So I think that's significant, does tell its own story. Then we have the White House claiming, as we have heard many times before, and in fact we've seen video evidence a number of times of this happening, and calling to question the veracity of those, as the Russians have. But we have seen this, and we've heard it so many times that it's almost certainly happening. Russia executing soldiers who disobey orders, says White House. So, that is interesting that it's coming from the top of the American hierarchy there. So just a short excerpt here saying, the White House claimed Russia is executing soldiers who fail to follow orders and threatening entire units with death if they retreat from Ukrainian artillery fire. White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said it was a development that security officials believe reflects Russia's morale problems 20 months into its invasion. Quote, it's reprehensible to think that you would execute your own soldiers because they didn't want to follow orders, and now threatening to execute entire units. It's barbaric, Kirby told reporters, but I think it's a symptom of how poorly Russia's military leaders know they're doing and how bad they have handled this from a military perspective. Another quote, we have information that Russian troops are indeed executing soldiers who refuse to obey orders. We also have information that Russian commanders threaten to shoot entire units if they try to retreat under Ukrainian artillery fire. So that is, I guess, some kind of verification of those claims. Russia endures heavy losses near Avdiivka, suffers from low morale. Again, referring to John Kirby in the White House. Russia is suffering significant losses and experienced low morale due to its attacks in Avdiivka. The quote is, we have information. That then goes back to talking about the execution of soldiers. But this idea that they are suffering in Avdiivka is also borne out by the ISW reporting yesterday, saying quite a lot about the losses in Avdiivka. Heavy Russian equipment losses around Avdiivka will likely undermine Russian offensive capabilities over the long term. Ukrainian Terrorist group spokesperson Stupun stated yesterday that Russian forces have suffered 5,000 personnel killed and wounded and 400 armored vehicle losses near Avdiivka. Now, the estimates from open source sources like Tatarigami say that over 200 are pretty much definitely, have been pretty much definitely taken out. 400 is obviously on the high end of the ranges, but it's still perfectly plausible from what we have seen. But this is in Avdiivka and Marinka since October the 10th. Satellite imagery has confirmed that the Russian military has lost at least 109 military vehicles, so that's Tatarigami's analysis, primarily armoured fighting vehicles and tanks near Avdiivka between the 10th and 20th. The Ukrainian reserve officer, Tatarigami, stated that Russian forces appear to be using fewer armoured vehicles near Avdiivka, although Russian forces may be regrouping for renewed large mechanized assaults as they did between the initial mechanized assaults on October the 10th and a second series of large mechanized assaults on October the 19th and 20th. The Russian command has funneled additional forces to the Avdiivka front to offset heavy manpower losses and maintain the Russian military's ability to sustain its ongoing offensive effort. The Russian command will likely struggle to offset Russian equipment losses, particularly in armoured vehicles. However, widespread Russian equipment losses and shortages in the first year of the full-scale invasion heavily restricted Russia's ability to conduct effective mechanized maneuver warfare during the Russian military winter-spring 2023 offensive, contributing to further losses in disorderly mechanized assaults near Vuhledar in the Donetsk Oblast in January and February 2023. Heavy losses around Vuhledar likely prevented the Russian command from committing to sustained mechanized assaults elsewhere in Ukraine later in the winter and spring offensive. Now, Vuhledar, they lost an absolute ton of kit. If you remember that town that sits above Pavlivka, below it, and Mikilska, the Russians were assaulting sort of in open ground up the hill, or even kind of before they even got to Pavlivka and Mikilska, below that area. And anyway, the Ukrainians had heavily mined it, and the Russians just blew themselves up time and time again. They just did the same thing day after day after day, and it was a graveyard of equipment where they lost over 100 bits of kit. Now, if that, as they say here, likely damaged the Russians' military capabilities such that they couldn't effectively sustain offensives elsewhere, then in Avdiivka, if they've lost double and possibly 4 times as many bits of kit as according to Stupin, if we go to the Ukrainian extreme, if they've lost 4 times as many pieces of mechanized equipment, then if they were hamstrung after Vuhledar, they would definitely be hamstrung after Avdiivka. So I think that logic is absolutely sound. Recent Russian equipment losses around Avdiivka appear to be much larger than earlier equipment losses around Vuhledar. It remains unclear if the prospect of further heavy equipment losses will deter the Russian command from launching another series of large mechanized assaults near Avdiivka. Russia has gradually mobilized elements of its defense industrial base, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the next video, to address equipment shortages, but has not done so at a scale remotely sufficient to offset the cumulative Russian equipment losses in Ukraine. Recent Russian losses around Avdiivka will likely lead to even more pronounced Russian equipment shortages and setbacks for any progress that the Russian military has made in addressing degraded mechanized maneuver warfare capabilities. So I think that is a pretty useful analysis. Now we're going to go to the sea, where a Russian minesweeper, the Vladimir Kotsitsky, reportedly got damaged near Sevastopol. It is reported that smoke poured from the engine room. A tugboat was brought to the ship and towed it back towards Streltska Bay. One would assume it's been hit by a maritime drone, maybe a torpedo-style drone, or maybe one of these sea babies. There are theories that the sea babies release weapons, possibly torpedoes or something, that can attack ships. So I don't know, something has happened to this kind of minesweeper. It's not the biggest of vessels, but that's exactly the sort of activity that you want to see the Ukrainians carrying out from a pro-Ukrainian point of view, and it will cause a change in behavior of Russian naval vessels, which again renders impotent the Russian usage of Sevastopol as a naval port. Then we have some footage here which is doing the rounds. I'm not going to show it for all the usual reasons that I will get restricted, but you can watch that by clicking on the link in the description below. This is a JDAM dismantling a warehouse with Russian electronic warfare complexes on the roof here. You can see the JDAM strike here at Novohorivka in Zaporizhia region is pretty significant, does a good job of taking out that kit. And again, as someone says here, the Ukrainian needs to do more of this. We don't see enough JDAM usage, and that might be partially due to the fact that it's less, maybe, I don't know, but it might be less likely that you've got spotting drones, right? Whereas you normally have drones to spot other kamikaze drones, and so therefore you can get video feed of that quite often. I don't know whether you have drone spotting for JDAMs. You've got static targets, and so therefore there's less need for the drone. The drone might do initial reconnaissance, get the coordinates back, and then you sort out a JDAM attack the next day where the drone isn't around, and then something like this will get hit and you don't have drone footage. Here we do have drone footage, but it might be you get less JDAM evidence because of that, or so both of these could be true. There are fewer strikes with JDAMs because of the issues with electronic warfare interference. However, there are claims that they have tinkered with JDAMs to kind of get around these issues. So, this is the arms race, the literal arms race, right? It's almost like how evolution works with predators and prey. So, prey will get faster, so the predator has to adapt to that and evolve, and then the prey evolves and the predator, and it goes like this all the time, and that's what happens over millions of years. Well, in terms of arms, you get an offensive weapon, defensive capabilities, offensive capabilities, defensive, and it goes up like this, and each side are adapting to the environment, to the needs. Necessarily, otherwise, they're useless and they don't survive as weapons, if you like. And so they have to adapt, and this is the same evolutionary pressures there for that. So yeah, here that's what we're seeing possibly with JDAMs. They are maybe being adapted to become more effective. So Russian sources claim that the infamous traitor Oleg Tsaryov, a former Ukrainian member of parliament who switched sides in 2014, though controversial, going pro-Russian after the Euromaidan protests, has been stabbed near his home in Yalta in Crimea. At the start of the full-scale invasion, some reported that Tsaryov could become the head of the Ukrainian puppet state. So he was one of these sort of big names possibly put forward to run Ukraine, even as a pro-Russian quisling ruler. But he is, I don't know if he's died or been hospitalized, but he has been, there's been an attempt at assassination there, or a successful one. Now we see Russia on fire here. Somebody been smoking a thermal power plant at Moscow. Media has reported that a gas pipeline has caught fire and reinforced concrete structures have collapsed. Latest reports say the fire has now been extinguished, but this is a significant issue for the Russians. If you're starting to have these kind of issues with major power plants, particularly in your capital, affecting your energy provision and your energy infrastructure, then that's not good news. So yeah, we'll see what comes about from that, if anything. And then finally, this segment, news of another sabotage attack by Ukrainian partisans in Luhansk. So this is someone recording themselves setting fire to a relay box at a railway station in I mean, who puts an H before a CH? An SH before a CH? Yeah. He says the line is now in manual mode, causing big delays on a line Russia uses to transport weapons. This kind of partisan activity is, I guess it's high risk for the individual, but it's not. It's relatively easy in many respects, and can cause. Yes, it might be fixable within 2 days, maybe a week, but this can cause issues for the Russians for sure, and I think is well worth supporting. I'm sure there are networks of partisans throughout the occupied territories that are doing stuff like this on a regular basis. Right, moving on to distant strikes. Here, the UK intelligence update says pretty much what I've been saying for the last week. I mean, it's pretty obvious. The Russian Air Force's long-range aviation fleet, LRA, of heavy bombers has not conducted air-launched cruise missile strikes into Ukraine for over a month, one of the longest gaps in such strikes since the conflict began. While Russia is still able to utilize other strike capabilities, the LRA had been a primary method for conducting standoff precision strikes. Russia almost certainly needed to reduce the frequency of its strikes to replenish its diminishing stockpile of AS-23A Kodiak cruise missiles. Kodiak, sorry. So that'll be the NATO name or code name for a particular cruise missile. That refers to the KH-101 and KH-102 cruise missiles. Russia will likely use any recently produced inventory LRA munitions to strike Ukrainian energy infrastructure over the winter. Russia will highly likely continue to supplement any such campaign with Iranian-designed one-way attack on crewed aerial vehicle attacks. I don't think they're just going to go for the energy infrastructure either. I think they will be collecting as much information as they can over time, and they will go for massive strikes. I think this will be a big challenge for the Ukrainians. It's a challenge that they are in the best position to deal with since the beginning of the war, because they have had a huge number of air defense systems that they have been given or that they have bought, and they are improving all the time. However, the Russians might try and overcome that with the biggest ever sort of waves of missiles and drones. This will be a real challenge when it does come, for sure. Russia used 6 drones overnight, so we are seeing there was a time maybe a month ago where they were releasing, it was at the height of the attacks on Odessa, where they were releasing sort of 30 to 40 Shahed drones a night. We haven't seen that for some time. Again, the question is always, well, why is that? If they do have the ability, why they're not doing it? So the conclusion for me is they don't have the ability. They don't have the stockpiles of these drones, or they don't have the stockpiles for those drones because they are stockpiling them, which is probably more likely. So they don't have enough of them. They are, as they produce them themselves or get them from Iran, but Iran will be under pressure to get them probably to Hamas, and there's issues with Israel, with the Americans actually striking Iranian production facilities inside Syria, because the US have been attacked something like 19 times now in their places out there, both ships and bases. Attempted attacks and some successful attacks, causing the injury of a bunch of US soldiers. Now, this might in some way help the Ukrainian cause, because if the Americans then start saying, right, we have bona fide rationale to take out Iranian production facilities, and we're going to do that, you start having the Americans doing that, you're going to probably have some pretty good success rates there. And that might have a knock-on effect to the provision of these munitions to Russia, which is why Russia have quite sensibly said, well, we're going to make these ourselves under license. And if they're having so many loophole successes in terms of sanctions, then they can make these things themselves, make them cheaper, and actually adapt them to the needs of what they have on the front line in Ukraine. So going back to my original point, though, they are, I would say, producing these or importing them at levels that won't sustain them using them now and using them in big waves over the winter period. So they are saving them for big waves and probably using just enough to get intel on air defense systems. So 6 drones being used would suggest that. Flash News says highlights of last night. Not highlights in that sense. A Mykolaiv region was attacked by drones at night. 2 of them was shot down outside the city of Voznesensk. There was a hit, no casualties. So there have been some claims. There's a solar panel. Here it is. So no photos yet from Voznesensk, but the local authority says critical infrastructure was hit. Early in the war, the bridge here was critical in Ukraine's defense as Russia looked to take the city of Mykolaiv onto Odessa. In Voznesensk, there is a huge solar power plant, so that could have been targeted. Don't know about the success or not there. No casualties, but there was infrastructure hit. Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation reported on the alleged downing of a Ukrainian drone of the Kursk region, so the Ukrainians still firing into Russia. And here, as you can see, just what I was saying, the USA struck 2 Iranian facilities in Syria in response to attacks on American bases. This is not to do with this segment, but China will miss the 3rd international meeting of the implementation of the Ukrainian peace formula, which will be held in Malta in October in a couple of days. So China really showing where their allegiances lie, I guess. Right, Ukraine's emergency services released a video from the fire station in Izium. Building was hit by an S-300 missile fired by Russia. These are the surface-to-air missiles that are adapted to surface-to-surface usage. But in that mode, they are less accurate. Here, we don't know whether they were targeting a fire station or whether they were just firing it blindly and just hoping to hit something, or whether they were trying to hit a genuine target, such as a military target or critical energy infrastructure, and because of its inaccuracy, it hit a fire station. Either way, it's not cool. No one was killed, 8 firefighters injured. This is not good when you're hitting emergency services like this, obviously. There's been another barrage on Kherson. The air raid warnings have just been switched off, but not before several explosions were reported in the Dnipro district of the city. Even more shelling than usual today by Russia, trying to stop more supplies and troops reaching left bank. Now, it's interesting. There are so many, and I need to be careful with what I say here, but there are so many protests going up around the world about what's happening in Gaza, and arguably for good reason, like the claim of indiscriminate bombing of supposedly Hamas targets or genuine Hamas targets, but you are killing an awful lot of Palestinian civilians, and I've seen lots of horrific footage where that is definitely happening, okay? And so you get this groundswell of protests around the world against Israel. And I think, right, we've had a war where hundreds of thousands of people have died. Hundreds of thousands of people. Like, a lot more civilians have died than in Gaza. Now, I'm not belittling what's happening in Gaza whatsoever. What I am saying is, where were you in your protests about Russia? Like, why is Russia not getting a protest? And of course, there's going to be ethnic and political allegiances and all sorts of other stuff going on. So that's why. But it's frustrating that there appear to be kind of double standards going on in what people protest. Russia have committed like countless war crimes. There's more evidence of Russian war crimes that you can poke a hairy stick at, and yet it's kind of become normalized, and so no one's particularly bothered. And this is exactly what Russia want. There should be protests around the world, and then when you get people like Viktor Orban and Robert Fico now saying we're not going to do, so they put a spanner in the works of EU help to Ukraine, it bloody pisses me off. Because you've got people who are clearly morally in the wrong, allowed to get voted in and then disrupt EU assistance to Ukraine. It really is frustrating. Anyway, going to ATACMS, we saw yesterday how there were some ATACMS missile parts that were photographed and filmed. Some Russian sources claiming that this was evidence that ATACMS would be shot down. The Russian MOD claimed that 2 ATACMS would be shot down. As David D says here, we are seeing the Russians post pictures of the rear section of the rocket on the ground saying they shot it down, but notice no puncture holes, as would be if it had been shot down by an air defense system. So normally you get shrapnel holes. And indeed, the ATACMS are not getting shot down, says David D, showing the rear motor section. ATACMS are designed to break apart over or near the target. This will leave the rear part of the rocket intact. This is what people were saying at the time. This is not evidence of these being shot down whatsoever. And it is what you would expect to see. It's what we saw near the Berdyansk, Luhansk air bases anyway. And we know definitely that they were hit. Well, then not only were people saying, hang on, this doesn't prove that they were shot down, but now footage is coming out of strikes in Luhansk, supposedly. Now, there are several claims about this. So Tim White here says, this place was more than shelled, it was ATACMS'd. Source in Ukraine confirms that they used US weapons to hit a military training ground. I found a video which the occupiers didn't manage to suppress. Okay, so this is some of the video footage coming out about a supposed ATACMS strike. And I was saying only yesterday and the day before that I am quite surprised that we haven't seen more ATACMS footage or evidence of them being used, because they claim to have various claims that they've used the first batch. That'd be 20 missiles. We've only seen 5 being used at air bases. Have more been used? We just don't have information about them, quite possibly. Now, someone else says not a training base. Anton Gerashchenko says Russian Telegram channels, so this is Russian sources, report that the video shows the destruction of 3 Russian S-400 anti-aircraft missile complexes. Right. I would say if you're going to use ATACMS, it's more likely the latter, S-400 systems, rather than a training base. I don't think a training base is... Well, it depends, actually, because there's a large number of personnel that could be taken out by cluster munitions, so it is plausible. But an S-400, 3 S-400 systems would be insanely good targeting, and you would think definitely something that ATACMS would be going for. The flip side of that is, what's the likelihood of 3 S-400 complexes being in the same place? Very low, I would have thought. So I don't know. Yesterday, Shoigu reported that Russian army destroyed ATACMS missiles. I don't think that's remotely plausible, given the trajectory of those missiles. I think they're difficult for the Russians to shoot down. But if the Ukrainians have taken out that many S-400, that's amazing. But pinch of salt and all that. Explosions in Tokmak have been reported. As per normal, there are explosions still taking place in the occupied territories in a number of places, Tokmak being a favoured target, well, really over the last 6 months, to be honest. Tokmak is well within, well, it's pretty much within artillery range now at the moment. Certainly has been within HIMARS range for a long time. Okay, moving on to other bits and pieces. So this is a poll. Trust in the government in Ukraine increases after Russia's full-scale invasion. Around 73% of respondents trust the president, 54% trust the government, 49 and 51% trust the regional and local authorities respectively, a recent poll has showed. The confidence in Zelensky and the government is higher among young Ukrainians and people with high incomes, while residents of Ukraine's eastern regions showed the lowest level of trust in the authorities, according to Kyiv International Institute of Sociology survey. That's what you would expect, and remember there still are going to be, particularly over in the east, a lot of sentiments that are either pro-Russian or not quite pro-Ukrainian, sort of sitting somewhere in the middle. That is good news. I mean, corruption has always been an issue in Ukraine, and it will be a long time coming for those figures to get up to really decent levels in terms of transparency and opinions of corruption. Thank you very much, Ivan, there. So we won't expect to see like really amazing numbers for some time, but over 50% for trust in the government is pretty decent, considering where the country was and where it is now, and 73% for Zelensky. He's got to be happy for this, and this is why some people are saying to Zelensky, now's your time to run a campaign, run an election for president again, because it's all about, I mean, this is just real politics. This is what all nations and politicians do in democratic countries, is like you pick your time, the time that's best for you for going for a campaign for re-election. Russia still retains some offensive potential and may attack again in the coming months, US National Security Coordinator John Kirby has said. So even though on the back of Avdiivka being difficult for the Russians, although they are making territorial gains, it's coming at a massive cost. Kirby is saying here, and even though ISW has just said what it has, that I shared with you, Kirby is saying that they may have Russia still retains some offensive potential. Of course, what that is, we don't know. How many troops they have in reserve is a bit of an unknown. They do continue with crypto mobilization. There's talk again over the last few days. Ukraine, the latest podcast, had a segment on sort of changes of laws and what the Russians are doing with immigrants, so legal and illegal immigrants, with regard to getting those people mobilized. And yeah, it could be that there are enough troops coming through for the Russians to be able to commit to a further offensive at some point. I think they are generally on the offensive in a number of places. I think we've moved from a Ukrainian offensive phase, and I think that's broadly culminated, although there's interesting activity in Kherson, where I think they stockpiled, if you like, a lot of troops and equipment ready for a pincer attack had there been more success up in Zaporizhia, and that didn't come, so they still have those troops and equipment in the Kherson region, and I think that they are more able, the Ukrainians, to commit to an offensive, to some kind of attack there, whereas that might not be the case elsewhere. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Hopefully that's of use to you. Toodle Pips, I'll speak to you soon in the next video.